best. Tonight on The Story, another brutal day on Wall Street as the worst financial crisis since COVID sends stocks plunging. We're getting reaction from former Oregon Congresswoman and President Trump's Labor Secretary, Lori Chavez-DeRemer. But first, the long-promised framework for a massive transportation funding package in Salem was just made public. And we're hearing from lawmakers and critics live, so buckle up. It's our big story tonight. For the last several months, if not longer, we've been waiting to see what Oregon lawmakers plan to do about transportation funding. The last major package addressing the issue came back in 2017, costing more than $5 billion. And we don't have to tell you about the need to fix up roads and bridges in the state. But the big question has been how to pay for it all. The framework to do that is out now. But it's worth noting it's just that, a framework, a sticking point, a starting point. None of this is set in stone, and the political haggling will only get more intense in the months ahead. But the big takeaways for drivers and taxpayers are a likely hike in the gas tax, higher registration fees and other fees when you buy a car, and phasing in a pay-per-mile plan. The Joint Committee on Transportation says they are not going to be spending money on big, flashy new projects. Most of it will go toward maintenance of the roads we already have. About 90% of the revenue will go into the State Highway Fund, which takes care of maintenance and operations for ODOT and local agencies. And 10% will go toward finishing up projects that got money from the last transportation package in 2017. The first item in the framework that's expected to bring nearly $1 billion a year to the State Highway Fund is a good old increase to the gas tax, a 20-cent per gallon jump over the span of 6 years. It would start next year, going up 8 cents a gallon, and then 3 more increases after that, every other year until 2032 for that 20-cent total. And beyond those hikes, the framework also proposes tying the gas tax to the rate of inflation. But that's not all to fund nearly $1 billion a year in revenue. Lawmakers are also proposing a $66 increase in registration fees, a $90 increase in vehicle title fees, and a 16.9% increase in weight mile fees. But wait, we're not done yet. The framework also includes what's called a system use fee, which would be a 1% fee based on the cost of a vehicle at the time you buy it. Now, to us, that sure sounds like a sales tax, but they're not calling it that. The commission notes that Oregon is one of only 5 states that currently does not have that revenue stream. And it's worth noting that every 2 years, the first $250 million from that fee would go towards finishing ODOT projects that have already been agreed to or are underway. The Abernathy Bridge comes to mind. So those are the most in-your-face tax and fee hikes highlighted in the transportation framework. But we've also spent a lot of time on this show talking about a potential pay-per-mile plan, or as lawmakers like to call it, a road usage charge. This framework sets a phased-in approach for something like that, starting with electric vehicles, or EVs, and eventually including new gas-powered cars. So starting next year, EV drivers would either pay by the mile or pay a flat annual fee. And they'd no longer be charged the higher registration fee that EV drivers currently pay. Over the next few years, newly purchased EVs and plug-in hybrids would be included. And by 2029, gas-powered cars that are model year 2030 and beyond that get more than 30 miles to the gallon would also pay the fee. No word yet on what the per-mile charge of flat fee would cost. The framework also aims to make a major investment in transit, apart from normal vehicles. And to pay for that, lawmakers propose increasing the payroll tax. The current payroll tax is 0.1%. Lawmakers say they could raise nearly $135 million a year if that was raised to 0.18%. And to pay for rail in Oregon, there are a couple more proposed taxes and hikes that we think you should know about. The framework asks to raise the vehicle privilege tax from its current 0.5% to 0.8%. Now that's a tax you pay when you buy a vehicle. And then add a 3% tire pollution tax, which would apply to tire purchases. Money from the tire tax would go towards rail, funding wildlife crossing projects, and salmon restoration efforts. Whew, okay, lots of numbers there. None of them great when it comes to your bank account. But again, this is just the starting point for lawmakers. Many of those ideas will change, but that's where they're at right now. This afternoon, we caught up with Representative Susan Mclain, a Democrat from a district that includes West Hillsborough and Forest Grove. She's a co-chair of the Joint Transportation Committee who helped craft the framework that we just talked about. And we started by asking her what she would say to Oregonians who see those proposals for higher taxes and fees and are worried about their already thin wallets being stretched even further.
Well, the first thing I would say that it really costs something, because if you don't do anything, it means that the system is really going to fall apart. And it really means that if they really do want to make sure that there aren't potholes, if they want to make sure that there's ability to deal with emergencies or weather during the winter for snow plowing and everything else, that we really have to show them what the costs are and show them what is happening with a diminishing fuel tax. I also would say that when we went around the state, some of you told us that paying a tax at the pump was probably one of the best ways to do it, because it didn't all come in one lump sum, and it came in a way that they were used to, and they also had an opportunity to just pay a little out at a time.
Now, we also pressed her on that system use fee proposal, which to us, again, appears to be a 1% sales tax on vehicle purchases.
Then there are 45 other states that may call it sales tax. But what it is a user fee. And what we're saying is that there's going to be a one-time systems charge or fee that they will pay when they buy a vehicle. And that 1% charge or fee is going to allow them to have actually something of a system that doesn't have potholes or problems. And so they won't be harming that new vehicle or that vehicle that is new to them as a purchased way of getting around their communities. And quite frankly, out of the 45 states that use this type of user fee, it is one that is in the top 3 revenues of how they fund their transportation system. So we're not new, we're not on the cutting edge. This is something that 45 other states actually already do.
Now, we also had to ask her about tolling, which is absent from this funding framework. So does that mean the idea is dead in Salem? Not quite.
I've talked about tolling for 20 years, and so it's nothing new and it's nothing that's disappeared. Quite frankly, it's something that the governor put on the sideboard because we decided at that time that it was important for us to look at all types of modes and tools for funding transportation, and we were leaning toward trying to figure out how to modernize the transportation funding. And so we felt that possibly the vehicle miles traveled, which we had a 12-year pilot on, was something that would be easier to administer and also less costly to administer. So yes, tolling is out there. Yes, tolling is expected on things like interstate bridges, and it's a federal requirement. And so something that, has to do with other elements or other systems, it's certainly out there, but it's not anything we're using in this package.
And finally, accountability within ODOT is mentioned in the framework, though not in detail, just that it's something with bipartisan support. So we asked Rep. Mclain what exactly that accountability looks like.
We have led a contract. It is a 2-month contract. They will have a report back to us with a look at the agency and some of our systems and some of our processes. And then that will send us into a full-blown type of an audit that will go in more depth in the areas that we think need to be reviewed. We also, from those 2 reports or audits, are going to be able to put some of those accountability structures or thoughts or checkpoints into this package, and we'll be able to do that by the end of our session.
Well, now for some Republican perspective tonight, we've got Representative Shelley Bossart Davis joining us live. She represents a district in the Albany area and is the co-vice chair on the Joint Transportation Committee. She also runs a family trucking company. Representative, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so what is your first reaction to this framework with so many new or increased fees here?
Well, like you, kind of your lead in, it took a long time to go through all of these lists of taxes and revenues and increased fees. So to me, our first reaction was pretty shocking. Listing out all of the different options to me and to fellow Republicans seemed very tone deaf. And I do just want to point out, this was a little bit framed as the joint committee or lawmakers, but this was certainly the Democrats' framework. So I just wanted to be clear on that. We didn't see it until Friday, or until Thursday, I'm sorry.
So that kind of leads into my next question here. As part of the Joint Transportation Committee yourself, I mean, how much of a say did Republicans really get in this framework? Does it feel bipartisan at all?
No, and it's because if you look at this framework, it is simply just looking at over 10 different ways we can increase or start new taxes. There isn't very much to say about, you mentioned accountability a little bit when you were talking about Rep. Mclain, but it doesn't talk about where it needs to be cut, where we need to pull back, where we need to focus back on core mission of ODOT. And for that, I was very disappointed.
So about this one-time road usage fee for new vehicle purchases, we asked Representative Mclain the same question earlier. Is this a sales tax on cars?
Oh, it absolutely is. And if somebody's going out to buy a car, they have to realize they're already paying registration title. In 2017, in that package, they added the vehicle privilege tax. So that's an additional tax. And now a sales tax of 1%. And I did hear, and they're trying to call this a one-time. This is a one-time every time you buy a new vehicle. And so they're labeling it as a one-time, a system use fee, but it's almost more like a sales tax or a vehicle ownership fee.
Now, this plan, as we laid out, has a painful number of fee hikes, but there's no denying ODOT is in a budget crunch. So is there any way out of this where we don't have to raise at least some of these fees?
Oh, absolutely. I think ODOT should be offering reductions that show that they're serious about living within their means. And if they fail to do that, I can absolutely tell you that Republicans are willing and happy to help prioritize some of that spending.
So what would a Republican version of this framework look like?
Well, it certainly wouldn't look like the first thing we're going to do is go out to Oregonians when we know that cost of living is the highest thing on people's mind and ask for more money. We would start with ODOT. We wouldn't start with asking Oregonians for money, and we would look to misprioritize their budget. We know that budgets reflect priorities, and we would be looking to see where we can pause, where we can cut, and help reprioritize back to core mission and what's really important to Oregonians' mind when they think of what ODOT should be responsible for doing.
All right, Representative Bossart Davis, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Now, it's worth noting that as the framework stands now, with all those taxes and fees we talked about earlier, it's still less than Governor Tina Kotek requested for transportation in her budget. So we asked for her take on this framework, and her office told us in part, "We have been underinvesting in the basic needs of our transportation system, and we cannot afford to push this problem into the future. This framework is a good starting point to stabilize the Oregon Department of Transportation's essential programs and make sure everyone's contribution is balanced." She went on saying, "I want to acknowledge that this framework reflects an increased investment from Oregonians to keep each other safe on our roads for years to come. I also remain committed to ongoing improvements in oversight and accountability to make sure ODOT delivers on what Oregonians are paying for." Well, now joining us live is Joe Courtwright. He's an economist who runs the City Observatory website. It's a think tank focused on urban policy like this. Joe, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Blair.
So those in the transportation world know you as a longtime critic of ODOT, so let's start there. Legislative leaders said they've ordered an external review of ODOT's project delivery and accounting practices, and the results will be incorporated into the final version of this package. Do you think that review will make a difference?
No, because the last time we had a package in 2017, the Oregon Department of Transportation paid $1 million for a consulting company called McKinsey, one of the world's biggest consultants. And they came in and said, yeah, ODOT has some problems, but it's going to do much better. And Governor Brown swore up and down she was going to implement that. And since then, ODOT has had $4.8 billion in cost overruns on just 3 big highway projects in the Portland area. So we've been down this road before, and we know that these management reports don't really do anything to change ODOT's behavior.
So when you talk about mismanagement of major projects, how bad is the impact? Like, do you think there's so much money being wasted that we shouldn't need to talk about fee increases at all?
Well, first of all, ODOT's revenue has gone up in the last 5 years, and their revenue from drivers has gone up. We're spending about $100 million a year more in motor fuel taxes than we were in 2020. At the same time, ODOT has had a series of projects that have experienced very big cost overruns, like the Abernathy Bridge, which was supposed to cost $250 million, is now costing over $800 million and is expected to go higher. And that is what's causing ODOT's financial problems. And they're having to take money that could otherwise be used for maintenance and other basic needs, and they're using it to pour into these very expensive construction projects.
Now, we noticed that despite the wide variety of other fees, this framework makes no mention of tolling or congestion pricing, and you've talked about that a lot before. So do you think it should have been part of the conversation here?
Well, in fact, ODOT predicated the Abernathy Bridge project on tolling. They assumed that they would have tolling revenue. And when that was taken away, that's part of what created this financial morass that ODOT finds itself in. As an economist, I think tolling is a very fair way if you want to pay for roads. But I think the more basic question is, do we really need something on the order of $10 billion worth of highway expansions in the Portland metropolitan area? Would that be worth it to the people who use them?
Now, looking at this laundry list of hikes, is there anything that you see here that you like? I mean, maybe not personally, but in terms of, what's a good policy?
Well, to me, I think the real issue that ODOT needs to grapple with is its spending priorities. It has de-emphasized maintenance and taking care of the system and is too focused on, again, these big projects. And they're projects that make a lot of money for consultants. ODOT has spent about $500 million on consultants on the Rose Quarter and the Interstate Bridge project. And again, the management review was done by one of ODOT's consultants who stands to make a lot of money when there are cost overruns. So we don't have a really good handle on the management practices, and that's the real problem.
So how would you propose fixing those project cost overruns?
Well, I think there's a real need to right-size them. If we were focused just on the essentials as opposed to very much bigger functions, like the Interstate Bridge would propose to rebuild 5 miles of freeway and 7 intersections, as opposed to simply replacing the bridge. So a simpler right-sized approach makes a lot more sense. And in fact, when she was Speaker of the House in 2021, now Governor Kotek, then Speaker Kotek, voted against a bill for ODOT, saying it didn't have a requirement for them to right-size these projects. So that's something we really need to do.
All right, Joe Courtwright, thanks for your time tonight. Okay, now it is your turn to weigh in. What do you think about the framework to fund Oregon's transportation system? What stood out here to you? Let us know. Email the story at kgw.com or call and leave us a voicemail, 503-226-5090. Well, coming up next on The Story, stocks plunged on Wall Street yet again today. President Trump's labor secretary, a familiar face to many Oregonians, weighed in on what she thinks about the market. That's coming up when The Story returns. Day on Wall Street today after President Trump's self-proclaimed Liberation Day on April 2nd, where he announced a minimum 10% tariff on all imports. Stock market had its worst 2 days since 2020. Among the biggest companies taking a hit today were Elon Musk's Tesla, down more than 10%. Boeing dropped more than 8%. And Apple, Visa, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs each lost more than 7%. In fact, stocks for all but 12 of the 500 companies that make up the S&P 500 index fell today. And the price of oil fell to its lowest level since 2001. Much of the fear today on the market stems of China's retaliation in the wake of Trump's tariffs. China struck back with its own 34% tariff on U.S. products beginning April 10th. The president posting on social media today saying his policies will never change and that this is a, quote, great time to get rich. Former Oregon Representative and Happy Valley Mayor Lori Chavez DeRemer is President Trump's labor secretary. She was on CNBC this morning to talk about the job market. And here's what she said when asked about the impact of these tariffs to American jobs as the national unemployment rate increased by 0.1% last month.
Certainly when we're talking about the market, it is a snapshot in time. And what I expect that this is not going to continue it to be stable. We're going to see growth for the American workers, and that is going to affect the market in a positive way.
Now, she was also asked about the possibility of eliminating tariffs on foreign companies that would agree to set up shop here on American soil.
Again, as a former mayor, oftentimes I heard from businesses who said we don't have the workforce. My job here at the Department of Labor is to make sure that we're focused and that we're making sure that our workers in America are skilled to do these jobs on the spot and we can get ready to go.
Now, that was just a snapshot of her interview this morning on CNBC, and you can find the full interview on our YouTube page. Stick with us. We're back right after this. The National Park Service has seen cuts to its permanent workforce, job losses in the hundreds, as part of President Trump's goal to cut federal spending. This weekend on Straight Talk, we're hearing from the former director of the Park Service about what those cuts could mean for visitors. Oregonian Chuck Sams III served as director of the service under the Biden administration. In an interview with Stephanie Domerat, Sams says the Park Service has already seen impacts because of a lack of funding, including system-wide closures at visitor centers and trails and camp closures at places like Yosemite.
A lot of these permanent workers have years of history understanding of what it takes to maintain and protect. Not to say that our seasonal workforce in the National Park Service is anything wrong with them. They're also strong, but you're losing institutional knowledge. And when you lose institutional knowledge, you can make mistakes along the way.
Sams added that cuts to park staff comes on top of a decade-long trend of the service losing workers at the same time that park visits are increasing. So to hear more from Sams, watch the full episode of Straight Talk this Saturday and Sunday at 6:30 or Monday night at 7 right after the story. And if those times don't work for you, you can watch anytime on our free KGW TV app, KGW Plus. It's available now on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. Well, that is the end of our show, folks. Thanks so much for watching. Timbers 360 is coming your way next. And don't forget, everyone has a story to tell. Have a great weekend. Weather's looking great. The first weekend of April. I hope to see you right back here on Monday night at 6:30.